Hi, everyone. Before we get into today's episode, we'd like to, as always, thank our executive producers, Tom McCool, Tony Turrin, Justus Ebel, and Jeremy Marcoux for supporting the show. If you'd like to help out the show, you can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/historiesmost, or shoot us an email at histories.most@gmail.com with any comments or suggestions that you might have. And as well as that, Alex has an exciting announcement to make about an upcoming event that you may want to check out.
Hello, everyone. I'm here to tell you that Intelligent Speech is back. Intelligent Speech is an online conference dedicated to connecting the best independent educational content creators with their listeners. And apparently, that includes me. This year's conference takes place on the 24th of April at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, or that's 3 p.m. London time. And I, Alex Clifford, host of History's Most podcast, I'm going to be appearing alongside the likes of David Crowther of the History of England, Liz Covart of Ben Franklin's World, Rudyard Lynch of What is Alternative History, and around 40 other great content creators. There is going to be, 24 hours of content in 4 simultaneous streams. So there is so much to discover and learn. It's your chance to interact with your favorite show hosts, as well as obviously fellow fans, in an immersive conference experience. Each session will be on a different theme around the idea of escape. And I'm going to be, as well as being part of a panel discussion about the Spanish Civil War, I'm going to be doing a presentation about a great political escape where one of my favorite political figures from history manages to save his country, his career, and his bank balance from seemingly insurmountable odds in 1931. Tickets for Intelligent Speech Conference are $30, but at the moment, on Early Bird, you can get it for $20. Not only that, but if you use my special discount code WAR, you'll get a further 10% off. So right now, I'm offering you a $12 saving. You can get tickets at www.intelligentspeechconference.com/shop. So once again, if you use at the checkout the code WAR, you get 10% off, and also I get a kickback. So that would be a great way to support History's Most. Thanks, everyone, and see you at Intelligent Speech.
How can a newly founded democracy survive in a society where a large percentage of the population rejects the entire system of democracy? A culture where the definition of patriotism is up for debate. For some, it means upholding that democracy and changing the country for the better using that new system, while for others, patriotism is rejecting the system entirely, because political parties and ideologies distract from something more important, a sense of being German, that one should strive to be above the political system. Does being patriotic mean supporting your country no matter what, even when it's violating international treaties? Or is it patriotic to bring those wrongdoings into the light? These are just some of the debates that raged inside Weimar Germany, and part of what made it host to history's most conflicted culture. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of History's Most. My name is Peter.
And my name is Alex, and it's our pleasure to be joined today on History's Most by Jack Arscott. Jack is a PhD student at the Institute of Modern Languages Research, London, and he is researching the journalism of the Weimar period, and in particular, looking into patriotism and concepts of kind of, I suppose, left-wing patriotism in Weimar journalism. So thanks so much for joining us, Jack.
Thank you. It's the pinnacle of my career so far.
I'm sure that's not true. In fact, I know it's not true. No, we're very excited to be joined by Jack today because we've been talking a lot about the Weimar Republic over the last few months. And as sometimes is our wont on History's Most, we've kind of very much zoomed in on kind of high politics and, the major players, whilst perhaps unforgivably ignoring some of the vibrant cultural life that Weimar is so well known for. And that is what we're going to address today. That's a problem we are going to solve because we have got an expert in that field, in the literary field of Weimar culture. So, Jack, I've talked for ages there, but I'm going to let you talk for a little bit. The Weimar Republic is, known for probably two things, to the layman perhaps: Nazis and culture, with a capital C. Could you paint us a picture of the cultural and literary scene in the Weimar Republic? Big question, I know, but, what were the kind of key developments happening at this time?
Well, I think when you're talking about culture in the Weimar Republic, it's impossible probably to overstate the importance of the First World War as a kind of hinge, a historical hinge, if you like. And it may seem like an obvious thing to say, but literature is my métier, but you can see the trauma of the First World War, I think, stalking pretty much every form of artistic expression in the Weimar Republic, particularly, of course, in the famous satirical paintings of Otto Dix and George Grosz, where you have these veterans with legs hanging off or no legs at all over the street, and the bourgeoisie are stalking past them, seemingly oblivious to their suffering. And I think much of the literature that was written at the time was explicitly or otherwise a reaction to what had happened in between 1914 and 1918, and to a certain extent what continued to happen, of course, after the end of the First World War, because one of the great charges leveled against the Weimar state by left-wing writers was precisely that there was far too much of the old Kaiserreich still intact, be it the judiciary, the civil service. I mean, the list is endless, and the of course we all know about famous novels like All Quiet on the Western Front, which were overtly anti-war novels. And I would also probably put in a mention there for a novel by the lesser-known Zweig, Arnold Zweig, who wrote in 1927 a book called The Case of Sergeant Grisha, actually about a Russian soldier who is captured. Well, I won't give away the ending, but he is a deserter, and Zweig engages with lots of very human themes about loyalty to the nation, loyalty to one's regiment. But I think perhaps often underestimated, although not by any means entirely overlooked, is the role of journalism in the Weimar period. It was, in any case, Weimar, a time when, rather like political parties, and perhaps it's not an unrelated phenomenon, but there was this proliferation of publications representing different political factions and often bankrolled by extremely partisan media tycoons, as we'd now call them. And my own research focuses on a left-wing journal called Die Weltbühne, the World Stage, which had itself been on a bit of a journey in its when the Weimar Constitution was signed off. The Weltbühne would have been about 14 years old, getting on 15 years old, and it began life as a theatrical review. So it was about theatre, and it was already beginning to pivot before the First World War, certainly the early days of the First World War, towards politics, and that it did definitively in the closing days of the war, and became the world stage, gesturing to its new enlarged focus. And I think you could argue that fixation on politics, and high politics, as you called it in your introduction, is probably characteristic of much of Weimar literature, certainly of the journalism, but I think also the novel, and I think that gave these the works of journalists like Kurt Tucholsky, who I'm sure we'll talk about later, the venom for which they're still quite well known, and which still divides opinion to this day.
So we've got a kind of cultural scene, which, as I think you've really demonstrated quite convincingly, is inseparable from the experience of the First World War. And you know, I would encourage our listeners, even if you just look up art from the Weimar era, it is just so imbued with the experience of the First World War. And just as so much of Weimar politics is about reacting to and getting over or responding to, in some way, the First World War, that it's seeped into popular culture and high culture to a massive extent. Let's focus in then for a time on the character that you've very briefly introduced us to there, Kurt Czelski. I'm probably going to pronounce wrong the whole episode, but one of the most famous journalists of the Weimar era, wrote for the Weltbühne that you mentioned, and he, like the wider Weimar culture, I believe he was also very much the First World War kind of is at the root of his kind of output, if you see what I mean.
Yes, I mean, Tucholsky, interestingly, and perhaps typically actually for writers of his generation, many of them at any rate, was not not necessarily even a pacifist, well, certainly not a pacifist before the First World War. He was politicized, turned into a pacifist by what he witnessed on the Eastern Front. He never fired a gun. He was behind the lines at one point, I believe, writing the regimental newspaper and doing various fairly menial chores that meant he didn't actually have to go over the top. And he said at one point that in fact he played every trick in the book in order not to. And when he returned, I mean, he spent some time during the war. He was billeted to the Courland, which is a little known pocket of Latvia, modern day Latvia, although it didn't exist then. And that was where he, in fact, met the love of his life, Mary, and this is a figure he comes back to quite often in his later journalism. And from there he went on to Romania, and eventually, of course, the war ends, and he comes back to Berlin. He's from Berlin, I should say, and this actually is his really his stock in trade, is taking off, sending up various types of Berliner who he's come across. And I think probably one of the most famous of these figures is called Herr Vendriner, who is a sort of politically, he's irresolute. You get the impression he'll go with the flow. He has some pretty unpleasant opinions, which come out over the course of these made up dialogues, which are really a little more than monologues, that Tucholsky invented. And I think this ingenuity of his when it came to mimicry, really, he was a bit of a ventriloquist, has led to him being interpreted as only as a comic. But he was much more than that. I mean, you mentioned his involvement with the Weltbühne. He was in fact the editor of the Weltbühne very briefly, for a matter of months, when Siegfried Jakobson, who had actually founded the Schaubühne way back in 1905, suddenly died, and Tucholsky took over. Tucholsky was Jakobson's mentee, if you like. I mean, Jakobson was a very strict editor, and a merciless critic of Tucholsky in his early years. And when Tucholsky got that job, he was a bit shell-shocked. I mean, he was grieving the death of one of his best friends by that point. But there's a great account of him sitting in the office of the Weltbühne in the days after Jakobson's death, and he's been anointed his successor. And he's sitting at Jakobson's desk, and he's doodling. He's staring into space, and he's doodling on a sheet of paper in front of him. And according to an eyewitness, he was simply drawing the same tiny outline of a man over and over, without really presumably knowing what he was doing, and we'll probably never know what he was thinking. But he's supposed to have been overwhelmed by the thought of taking on this responsibility, and within a few months, he makes over the editorship of the Weltbühne to Karl von Ossietzky, who I'm sure we'll hear about later, who's became a very prominent cultural and social critic. But Tucholsky really, to my mind anyway, encapsulates what the Weltbühne was about. He was a ferocious critic of what he saw as the hangover of the Kaiserreich, of the imperial period. He had some favorite victims, if you like. He despised the judiciary. He hated the sort of limp, politically biased civil service. He thought essentially that all of German society needed a big wake-up call, and that he says at one point in a letter that the Weimar Constitution was really just a scrap of paper that nobody observed, and he was not alone in this. He perhaps was alone in the caustic nature of his criticism, which eventually earned him the charge of really aiding and abetting the downfall of the Weimar Republic. Thomas Mann's son, Golo Mann, was a sort of prominent proponent of this idea that what he described as the unbridled left had brought down Weimar at a time when it was under enough pressure as it was from the right wing, that the least the left could do was support it. I mean, there's an extent to which that argument holds up, in that Tucholsky went on record several times as saying, "This isn't my republic. This isn't a republic in my image. It's not serious about protecting people's rights and rooting out, for example, feudal privileges." And it was actually Ossietzky, who I mentioned earlier, who I think who dug out these figures, which I unfortunately don't have off the top of my head, but I can sort of approximate it. And Tucholsky would go on, would come back to this basic injustice time and again, namely that in the Weimar Republic, if you were a left-wing radical who had broken the law, you were far more likely than a right-wing assassin, of which there was no shortage, and some of whom I think you probably talked about already on this series. You're far more likely than that right-wing assassin to face a heavy jail sentence. Of course, we all know the most notorious right-wing thug of all, whose sentence was commuted, and would go on to play a very fateful role in German history. But the basic idea was that the German judiciary was biased against anyone who wanted to change the order of German society. And it's perhaps just worth saying briefly that it wasn't just written satire, because Tucholsky collaborated with a German photographer with the perplexing name of John Hartfield, on a book, 1929, I think it came out, called Deutschland über alles. It was, of course, an ironic title, Tucholsky being the antithesis of a nationalist. And Hartfield's expertise was in taking photos from newspapers of the day and reconstituting them in this sort of collage to make fun of those figures. And he and Tucholsky collaborated on this book, in which all the usual suspects, as I say, the judges and the generals and the civil servants, were depicted verbally and visually as monsters who were responsible for really stifling the Weimar Constitution at birth.
Do you think you talk about how there's kind of this later argument that the fact that there's this left-wing intellectual movement that is so critical of the Republic, so just hostile to the democratic system, not necessarily democracy per se, but the Weimar system. And of course, that echoes, Nazi propaganda of the era was usually the big enemy was the system, by which, of course, they could mean anything they wanted, but in essence, Weimar. Did anyone at the time, any of their colleagues, friends, fellow travelers, if you like, on the left, kind of pull them up on this, people like Czelski, and say, we need to get behind the Republic. There's a kind of greater threat, or was this kind of unanimous on the intellectual left, this criticism?
I think you've put your finger on the tension in the intellectual left that would eventually widen into a fault line, and in the end would swallow the left as a sort of meaningful political force, ending, of course, in Nazism. And the simple answer to your question, if there is one, is that there was no consensus. That you had plenty of people who would counsel precisely what you've just suggested, supporting the Republic at every turn, if only to shore it up against obvious breaches of the law and coup attempts that were, as you well know, 10 a penny at that time. And and I mean, there are several articles actually published by the Weltbühne that spring to mind when you talk about this thorny question. And one of them is by a writer called Otto Flake, who he wrote an article. He was a regular contributor, and he wrote an article in, I think it was 1922, called "The Birthday of the Republic." And it's a fairly short article, very, I mean, for him, uncharacteristically succinct. And he's objecting to the fact that the national day of celebration of the Weimar Republic happens to, or does it just happen to? Of course, he insinuates very strongly that it's quite deliberate. Happens to coincide with the day Imperial Germany defeated France in 1871, and also incidentally, again perhaps not, 1701, when the Prussian king was crowned in Königsberg, as it then was Kaliningrad now. And so Flake's argument is that in fact the Weimar Republic is perpetuating this kind of reverence for Prussian culture, which is synonymous in the sort of lexicon of the Weltbühne stable with militarism, and of course the reaction. And what Flake is really saying is that the Republic isn't helping itself, and that it can't expect people like him, although he was by no means as far to the left by a long chalk as people like Tucholsky. But why should people like him support this republic when it doesn't appear to know what's good for itself? I mean, Tucholsky put it perhaps even more. I mean, typically sort of rambunctious style. He really does. He attacks this idea that the Weltbühne were negative. This charge of negativity, which came, I think, from right across Weimar society, against these sort of carping, as they would have it, left-wing intellectuals who were never content. This charge of negativity really rankled with people like Tucholsky, to the point that he wrote an article in 1919, so quite early in the period, actually entitled "Wir Negativen," we negatives, and in it he takes up, or he preempts, chronologically speaking, Flake's idea that there is nothing actually to be proud of in this republic, and he does it with recourse to an image, which is that of the Augean stable. And he says we are called in German Nestbeschmutzer, so soilers of your own nest, if you like. But you can't soil an Augean stable. And he says, why should we? What sense would it make to park oneself on the roof of a crumbling edifice, for which read the Weimar Republic, and let rip the national anthem? And that, I think, that would be the rejoinder of Tucholsky and people like him to those who said, and they were great in number, that they were actually contributing to the sort of crisis of legitimacy that the Weimar political class had. Perhaps just one more that springs to mind in that context is the famous disagreement between the Mann brothers, Thomas and Heinrich Mann. I mean, Thomas Mann, justly or otherwise, you could talk till the cows come home about that, is regarded as an apolitical, the earlier Thomas Mann, should I say, based on his book, the Observations of an Unpolitical Man. It's really a collection of essays, and he was somewhat ashamed of it later. But this came out in 1918, and he accuses people like his brother Heinrich, who was also a novelist, not quite as highly rated, but in my opinion ought to be. And he accuses people like Heinrich of Zersetzung, or of fomenting Zersetzung, which is really the disintegration, the erosion, I suppose you could say, of order. Of course, that's a sacred German concept, Ordnung, and anything which might unleash chaos is, of course, I mean, in the mind of someone like Thomas Mann, tantamount to nihilism or nihilism. And Heinrich Mann, and Heinrich Mann himself did write on occasion for the Weltbühne, and his books were very well received in the journal. He actually embraces this charge, and he says, if we're responsible for Zersetzung, then so be it. I welcome that, because Zersetzung, erosion of the status quo, is on the right side of history. If you are to achieve progress, then you have to have people who are constantly nibbling away at the complacency of those in power and their apologists. So that you're quite right to say that is, I mean, it's probably a question that will never be resolved fully, but it certainly exercised people at the time.
It's fascinating that, because, you know, the kind of popular image of Weimar culture, I don't think really gets into that detail of how conflicted so many of these cultural figures were. And I think there's a kind of misconception that because culture flourished in the Weimar Republic, you know, artistic people, intellectuals, writers must have loved it. And yet here are some of the most prominent ones arguing bitterly with each other about whether they should or should not love the Republic.
Yeah.
I think one of the really interesting questions, I mean, it's exactly right that, of course, so much of the old Germany survived into the Republic, you know, from the national anthem to the strange, you know, surprisingly for Germans, so illogical state structure of each of the kingdoms, which was, you know, positively feudal. But they were simply transferred into democratic states within federal Germany. And it was nothing like what you saw after the Second World War, where kind of root and branch rebuilding of institutions and things like that. It's not really a question, it's more of a comment, I suppose. The charge that these people were undermining the Republic, might it fall down on the idea that, well, the enemies of the Republic, who primarily lay on the right, and they, of course, were the ones responsible for its dismantling, didn't care what a few left-wing intellectuals thought one way or the other, that whether or not Die Weltbühne towed the Republican line or not, it wasn't going to affect the attitude of the far right, for example.
Yeah, and I mean, the question of how effective they were really haunted a lot of these writers, and arguably is what led Czelski to put down his pen forever in the 1930s, and cease to write, because he thought the battle was lost. And right through the 1920s, they worried about how much what they were saying really resonated with the majority population. And it was particularly sort of acute, I think, for these people, because they like to call themselves the spokespeople of the working classes. I mean, the working classes were the subject of some pretty dreadful, actually, from a sort of literary point of view, odes in the pages of the Weltbühne. That they were the intended audience for a lot of these quite hectoring pieces that you read. And incidentally, in the Weltbühne archive, for those who are curious and have German, is available in its entirety online, which is a bit of a treasure trove on a rainy day. If you are, as I am, grappling with this journal for a PhD project, there does, I'd be lying to say there wasn't a point where you reach saturation point when it comes to left-wing, well, not it need only be left-wing, but of course in this case it is revolutionary rhetoric. And I think part of the frustration is that it fell on deaf ears, and of course we're talking here fairly broad brushstrokes, but ultimately they did not succeed, and this constant idealism, this fire that you can almost feel coming off the pages of the Weltbühne was all for nothing, and they must have sensed that. And yet, until deep into the 1920s, it did, I think, tail off somewhat. Until deep into the 1920s, people were writing in the Weltbühne articles that were effectively manifestos, of course, those manifestos were in many cases doomed to never really see the light of day, because the people who are supposed to throw off the shackles, rise up, drive out the exploiting industrialist class weren't reading them. And I think it's perhaps a good moment to talk briefly about the concept of the other Germany, das andere Deutschland, which had a very long life. It's perhaps these days most associated, ironically, you could say, with Thomas Mann. During the Second World War, he became, of course, the de facto spokesman for German literati abroad, and indeed for non-Nazi Germany abroad. And I say non-Nazi Germany it was a deliberate note of caution, because the perennial question that circled around this phrase, das andere Deutschland, the other Germany, from its inception in the Weimar period, is that of what it really meant. Who were the other Germans? This silent majority who were being ignored and not represented, and ultimately crushed. Well, I think from the point of view of the Weltbühne authors, the other Germany was a probably entirely imagined, sort of politically conscious and highly literate working class, to which they were speaking directly through this organ. Die Weltbühne was not a party organ. It took in writers who wrote for Vorwärts, the social democratic paper. It took in paid-up communists at times, but what it prided itself on was precisely this independence, and yet it saw itself as, and not without justification, as the foremost platform for a repressed block of Germans whose day would come. I think the other Germany is a very good way of actually of explaining the ultimate failure of this group of writers, because they never quite succeeded in explaining what it consisted of. It was obviously supposed to be left wing, but as ever, I would argue on the left wing there was all sorts of infighting going on, all sorts of internecine strife about what the best way forward was for the left wing at the time. And so in the end, I think the other Germany becomes a rather sort of plaintive battle cry. And its time never did come.
Makes one think they maybe should have concentrated on the real Germany rather than the other one that they couldn't quite define and weren't quite sure whether it existed. I can't leave Kurt, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong again, Czelski, without reading a poem that I came across from him about one of our favourites here on History's Most. Possibly he's got more airtime than any other single person, which you'd be very happy about, Erich Ludendorff. And this is what Czelski had to say about him when he got into his kind of conspiracy theory phase. Are you anxious, Eric? Are you scared, Eric? Does your heart pound, Eric? Do you take flight? Do the Masons, Eric, and the Jesuits, Eric, want to stab you, Eric? What a fright. Those Jews are becoming ever unseemlier. All misfortune is the work of these schemers. Obviously, it doesn't quite rhyme in English, but I'm sure it did in German. But it's fantastic, I thought. Piece of satire, I suppose. And I'm sure it would have annoyed the heck out of Erich Ludendorff. Linking to what you were talking about with the other Germany, this idea that somehow that they could awaken, a different Germany, the one that they were so dissatisfied with. I know you've in particular been looking at patriotism, the thorny question of patriotism on the left. How did left-wing intellectuals of the era feel about patriotism? Because a lot of the patriotism, we might talk a little bit later about the kind of nationalistic side of Weimar culture. That was clearly something that they rejected. So what were they comfortable with? It's something that probably to this day, listeners in the UK may, in the last few weeks, there's been a bit of an issue about left-wing patriotism. So
Yes.
what do you think?
Well, again, it's a question that it's impossible to boil down to one straightforward answer. I think it's fair to say that the bulk of the Weltbühne writers would have run a mile at the suggestion that they were even patriotic, let alone nationalistic, because they saw that word as so soiled by association with the Kaiserreich and with the bloody war they just witnessed. And Tucholsky was among them. At one point he memorably writes in a column, if somebody asks you, do you love your Heimat, which is, as you're no doubt aware of, this arguably untranslatable German term for home, which has all sorts of connotations, including simply your home region, where you're from. It doesn't even have to be geographical. It can be a state of mind. Some would argue. I won't go into that. But Tucholsky says, if somebody asks you, do you love your Heimat, then you should say, well, can I love myself? Can I love my hair, my blood? In other words, the Heimat is so sort of intrinsically bound up with who you are, that it would be silly to deny some sense of affiliation and affection for it. But he goes on to say, if somebody asks you, are you a patriot? Then you should box him over the ears. And I mean, Tucholsky often rails in fairly, I have to say, fairly sort of loose terms against nationalists of all stripes, and he appears to have no qualms about lumping patriotism and nationalism together. And there were a number of voices that contradicted that, and in quite interesting ways as well. I mean, my own project is trying to establish three different forms of left-wing patriotic thought in the Weltbühne, and one of them, I mean, going back, I suppose, to what you were saying earlier about the individual states in Weimar Germany, and this keen sense of localism that arguably persists to this day in Germany to a far greater extent than it perhaps has here in the UK. There was one fascinating article written by a chap called Wilhelm Michel, all about the Palatinate area of Germany. And it's fascinating in all sorts of ways, but he breaks down the word Pfalz, or rather he traces it back to which is the German name for the Palatinate. The Pfalz has now been absorbed into Rhineland-Pfalz, the Rhineland-Palatinate region. That happened after the Second World War. But he traces the etymology of the word Pfalz back to the Holy Roman Empire, when the Pfälzer were the sort of local palaces, strongholds of the electors Palatine in the Holy Roman Empire, the sort of emissaries of the emperor himself, and he uses that to make the point that actually modern day Pfälzer, modern day residents of the Pfalz, in feeling patriotic about their own region, a sort of localist patriotism, I argue in my thesis, they are actually demonstrating their commitment to the idea of one Germany, a Germany, albeit comprised of plethora of different states, but a Germany that answers to the name of Germany. And the reason he felt the need to write this article is because, of course, the Palatinate is where, at the time, there was this separatist movement bubbling up. There was a small band of separatists who wanted the Palatinate to join with France, become part of France. And of course, Michel wants to distance himself from them. And to that end, he actually accuses the Bavarians, who at the time the Pfalz was part of Bavaria, had been part of the Kingdom of Bavaria for quite a long time, although it changed hands on a couple of occasions. The Bavarians like to paint the Pfälzer as these sort of want-away separatists who didn't care about the German Reich, and incidentally, that word Reich did hang around, outlived the Kaiserreich itself. And Michel says, well, hang on, the Bavarians have retained a lot of their privileges, and there's, he claimed there was even a significant constituency of people in Bavaria who wanted to break away from Germany. So it's a bit rich of them to accuse us of wanting the same. And he uses this phrase, centripetal forces. He says, as opposed to centrifugal forces, he says actually the will of the Pfälzer has always been towards the center rather than away from the center, and that doesn't necessarily go for everywhere in Germany. So according to him, it's possible to be both regionalist, if you like, and patriotic. And there isn't. I mean, it's interesting in his case that um, that the enemy really are his compatriots who would misrepresent the Pfälzer and not some other nation. He's not seeking to define himself against another nation. He's defining himself against other German citizens who aren't as committed to the idea of Germany as he is. And of course, there's always a lot of essentialism in this, because that claim kind of requires you to believe that all Pfälzer are of one mind and one politics. But I think that's one way in which patriotism became legitimate for some writers in the Weltbühne. It was a way of expressing a sort of more hyperlocal sense of belonging that didn't necessarily try to demonize rival nations. And then there was a faction who believed in what I'm calling again internationalist patriotism, the idea that Germany deserved a place at the table. The European, this new sort of banquet of I suppose, of diplomacy that the end of the First World War was supposed to bring with it, with the advent of treaties and multilateralism and the League of Nations, that Germany should be an equal partner in that. But in order for that to happen, they had to accept the Treaty of Versailles, hard though it may be. So sacrifices were needed, and one of those was swallowing their pride, swallowing any notion of revanchism, which was, of course, very prominent at the time with the stab in the back myth. And so I think patriotism, insofar as it was accepted by the Weltbühne stable, was always an alternative form of patriotism to the one that they had been accustomed to before the war. It tried to take lessons from the war and redefine what it meant to love your country.
It's interesting because it's kind of you had also the kind of social democratic attempts to turn the Republic into some sort of, to turn the the red, gold, black into an alternative patriotism to the Kaiserreich. But the Weltbühne writers seem to have taken a slightly different approach. One question that comes to mind, and I hope if this makes sense, the Weltbühne, I think, famously published an expose of the German military illegally cooperating with the Soviet Union to carry out weapons development, training, this sort of thing, with arms that they'd been forbidden under the Treaty of Versailles. And the Weltbühne, I think I'm right in saying, exposed this. It's a great scandal in the mid-20s. But naturally, it really divided opinion at the time. Is what they were doing treason, which is certainly how some would have interpreted it, by undermining their own nation? Or did anyone at the Weltbühne think that this was patriotic? This was the right thing to do? Well, obviously they thought it was the right thing to do, but do you see what I mean? That this was the right thing for Germany to expose German wrongdoing to the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the expose you refer to as a collaboration between Ossietzky um, and a writer called Bertolt Jacob. Um, and as you say, it made waves because it laid bare the extent to which Germany was flouting the Treaty of Versailles. I think I can't think of off the top of my head of any utterances from Ossietzky himself, where he defends it in a patriotic light. But I think it certainly fits into the this idea of Germany re rebranding itself, remodeling itself. I mean, in a way, I think that is analogous to the old saw about Germany going from after the Second World War, going from the Sorgenkind, the enfant terrible, if you like, of Europe, to the top of the class. When it after the Wirtschaftswunder and after it was rehabilitated on the international stage, and of course now we know what Germany stands for. I think a similar process of sort of soul searching and well, I suppose realigning is what these people, the likes of Ossietzky, were calling for, and that in itself was not an anti-patriotic stance. I think many of them would have argued quite the opposite, and one of the reasons for that, or one of their lines of argument, would have been that if Germany persists in ignoring the constitution and saber rattling at France, then the next war, which is an inevitability, is bound to end in the destruction of Germany, partly as a consequence of their total sort of moral isolation. And it's interesting that how often this idea of morality comes into these patriotic kind of disquisitions. They wanted Germany to prove its readiness, prove that it was worthy of a place in a kind of enlightened community of European nations. And there was a fascinating idea going around at the time. You do see it in several different places. And it was actually, I mean, it was reproduced in the Weltbühne on two occasions that I know of, that the defeat of Germany in the First World War actually, mystifyingly, left the moral fiber of the German nation intact in a way that the French and the rest of the Entente were not. The French and their allies were somehow physically spent by the exertion of the war, and Germany, in losing the war, had somehow emerged the more vital, physically and morally, and that of course is, and that was used as a justification for Germany actually becoming not just an equal player, but a first among equals, for people in particular, like Helene Kessler von Montbard, who was a fascinating writer, better known as Hans von Kahlenberg. She took on a male pseudonym, and she published this remarkable, really, serialized letter in the Weltbühne, in which she was adamant that that it was now Germany's sort of messianic duty to lead Europe, precisely because it had lost the war. And I think it's impossible to really get to the bottom of what she was getting at here. There's certainly a rather strange to our modern ears eugenicist theme running through her work, and which says that Germany was somehow the more virile nation. France had perhaps spent, as I said earlier, spent its force on the battlefield, and that in fact France, in wanting, as she claimed they did, to occupy yet more of the left bank of the Rhine, that sort of totem of German sovereignty, in wanting to occupy even more of that area than they had been, than the Treaty of Versailles had conferred on them. They were actually, the French, trying to enhance their gene pool by injecting it with a healthy dose of raw German physicality. And I'm aware now we've strayed a long way from Ossietzky's investigation into the Schwarze Reichswehr, but there was definitely, I suppose, all of this is to say that Germany, in the wake of the war, was seen by people right across the left-wing spectrum as in need of a moral rebirth, and of course putting an end to militarization, disarmament, both literal and symbolic, was the first step along that road.
Can we move then to the polar opposite, if you like? Because in a way, we've alluded to it before, the fact that, you know, the message of these particular writers doesn't get through. And one of the reasons for that is because it's probably underrated the extent to which Weimar popular culture was actually nationalistic and you know, more at home on the right really than the left, despite the avant-garde that's so famous. So the kind of polar opposite of the that left-wing intellectual school was the kind of Deutsche National culture, a phrase that is quite hard to sum up, I think, in English, but it kind of, nationalist is the easiest way of saying it. But could you kind of talk us through them? What are the kind of poles of the opposite culture, of the not the counterculture, I suppose, but this nationalist side of that the Weltbühne so, you know, despised?
Yes, well, I think I mean another word for this for Deutsche National was in fact Neudeutsch, in some contexts at any rate, which is to say that the paramilitary groups who identified themselves as Deutsche National, in a strange kind of, and probably quite dark kind of way, like to think of themselves as somehow, well, the German phrase would be Bahnbrecher. They were breaking new ground. They were paving the way for a new Germany to rise out of the ashes of the war. In a way, I mean, you know, on face value, of course, not dissimilar from what the left were calling for. Only for the right, the war had been a sort of purifying battle for the soul of the German nation, in which they were going to somehow discard the elements of the kind of imperial society that were holding Germany back. And you see this idea in Thomas Mann in the Observations of an Unpolitical Man I mentioned earlier, that the First World War was going to be a sort of cathartic experience, and that all you'd have left at the end was the sort of lean stripped back, pure Germany. And so I think that's probably where this label Neudeutsch is coming from. I mean, it's perhaps worth saying that German nationalism, certainly in the Kaiserreich, and to an extent in the Weimar Republic, was salonfähig, to use another German word, which I think there isn't really a direct translation. It was sort of proper. It was acceptable to talk about. Precisely because Germany being quite a delayed nation, if you like. We like to talk about the Sonderweg, of course, and this idea that Germany's evolution was belated. They tried several times in their fairly recent history to form a nation, and it didn't really happen, and of course until Bismarck. But in the early 1800s, when it was first attempted in a sort of meaningful, concerted way, of course, the cry was the German nation. The German nation would somehow allow all these different states and principalities, kingdoms to coalesce. And so there was an extent to which the Deutsche National circle, or that's not really a very good way of putting it, because it was really a ragbag, a huge but baggy group of agitators. That's the way in which they appealed, I think, to the more centrist inclined Germans of the Weimar period. They had this kind of unimpeachable history behind them. Who wouldn't want Germany, especially now, to be one nation? Now, so much blood has been spilled, they would say. But of course, along with that came all sorts of pretty horrendous prejudice. Anti-Semitism, of course, is a word that many people think of if you say Germany to this day. But that was really, I think, emboldened during the Kaiserreich, and didn't really go away, of course, in Weimar. But it wasn't by any means the most perhaps central of the demands of the Deutsche National associations. And I know you and I are both fairly familiar with this book by Roger Chickering about these associations, which were they were largely, not exclusively, I think, citizen-run organizations that represented different spheres of interest, whether it was the enlargement of the German fleet, of course, a very sore point with Germans at the end of the 19th century, that the English, of course, had this all-conquering navy, and the Germans didn't, and they thought that if you were to be a world power, then that was indispensable. And this idea of Germany as a Weltmacht, having its Platz an der Sonne, its place in the sun, was really, I think, the guiding light for the Deutsche Nationale. Perhaps another figure that's worth kind of alluding to is that of the pioneer, and the pioneer was beloved of another of these associations. I've mentioned the fleet, this fixation on the German fleet, and you have the Flottenverein, who represented that particular cause. But you also had an association called the Ostmarkverein, the Ostmark, falling. It's a fairly broad historical label, but pretty much encompassing East Prussia, not just East Prussia, right up to and spanning much of what is now Poland. which the Germans saw as their rightful Lebensraum. And the Ostmarkverein were absolutely petrified at the thought of Slavic infiltration. And the pioneer was this brave German out on the periphery of sovereign German territory, whose job it was to look out for the rampaging Slavic hordes that were at any moment going to flood over the German border and submerge German society. And so that was a probably more I would argue, certainly in what I've read, more than the alleged Jewish threat. I think the bogeyman at the time was the Slav, whether he be a Pole or whatever, happened to be exercising them at the time. Of course, it's easy to forget that the Jewish population of Germany had a large assimilated section without whom German society wouldn't have been able to function. And so, of course, taking on the Jews in a way that in the way that Hitler later did, perhaps wouldn't have played so well at the time, nor perhaps been practical. So I think the Slav did that job for them at the time.
I think one of the interesting things about, and one of the really successful things about Deutsche National culture and thought, when you compare it to the left-wing intellectual thought, which failed in inverted commas, in the sense that obviously the Republic fails, is the fact that it was seen as almost, and you kind of alluded to it there, as almost politically neutral, despite the fact it was actually very right-wing in large part. People like, to use another of my favorite examples, President Hindenburg, no one could have been in doubt that he was Deutsche National in his mindset. And yet at the same time, he was, also widely accepted as being Überparty. Yeah. Which actually one of our previous interviews talked with George Vasek talked about how Germans see being above party, at least in that era, is kind of better than anything else you could possibly ever be. What a virtue it is to be above party. But the idea that Deutsche National is both a kind of far-right ideology, the Deutsche National Party is no doubt on the far right of German politics, and yet seemingly also just looking out for your country, politically neutral, politically bipartisan, and in a way that the kind of left intellectual views just never were.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to this sort of I think you could call it a sort of almost congenital fear in German society at this time of fracture, of the folk breaking apart at the seams, people being loyal to different parties, and again, Thomas Mann, I think, encapsulates this very well in a passage. I think again it's from the book I mentioned, The Observations, where he recounts being in the tram, I think probably in Munich one day, and he sees a firebrand young socialist. We have to assume, because it's Thomas Mann writing disparagingly. A firebrand young socialist comes out of a venue, and he's obviously just been stirring up the audience, and he's still on a high as he gets on the tram, and he's talking 19 to the dozen about his demands and the injustices of the day, and Thomas Mann then zooms in this passage on the figure of the conductor of the tram, and the conductor for Thomas Mann is the embodiment. It's no exaggeration to say, of the German Bürger, another word that's quite hard to really do justice to in translation. But the middle of the road German citizen, with shades of the bourgeois about him, for whom political affiliation is anathema, and he doesn't understand it. He thinks it's undignified. It's certainly, he would say, anti-national, and above all, it's vulgar. It's vulgar to support one side over the other, and to, I suppose, identify yourself with a particular party, and in so doing, give up your own individuality, as he would see it. And his description of the conductor is remarkable, because it makes you think of the famous self-portrait of Albrecht Dürer's, in which he depicts himself as a Christ figure, and he has these long flowing locks. He looks rather sort of ascetic, and of course utterly ineffably pious, and certainly floating above the throng. And the conductor looks at the activism, I mean, then as now, being a label that the reaction like to throw at people who want to change society for the better, as though he were only really interested in himself. And yet, of course, the kernel of, or the crux of Mann's criticism is precisely that he isn't, precisely that he's surrendering his individuality to the party machine. And this is a collision for Mann of the old and the new. And of course, he wants to preserve the old, and he wants to defend it against, again, the Zersetzung, the corrosion of party politics. And I think that definitely does run right through the it runs right across the divide between right and left. This idea of political commitment. There were all sorts of things, of course, in Weimar that people like Thomas Mann, but far to the right of him, the Deutsche Nationale thugs that you were talking about earlier, the kind of people who joined in with the generals in staging all sorts of failed coup attempts. There were all sorts of things that they despised, which for them came down to political enfranchisement of the women, of those members of the male population who hadn't been allowed to vote until then. I mean, the number of women in work, their sexual and sartorial freedoms, which were sort of there for all to see on the streets of the big cities, not least Berlin. That was held up as somehow a reflection of what happens when you allow politics to take over, and of course, to the modern sensibility, this seems sort of monstrously backward, and conservative, and so it was. But it's easy, I suppose, to overlook these days quite how new this idea of democracy was at the time, and the fear that its opponents had of the chaos that would ensue. And I come back again to this idea of disorder, this German terror of disorder. And all of that, of course, was accentuated by the fact that the Weimar Republic had all of these external obligations like reparations and all the other things that you'll have talked about earlier in the series. All of these things pressing in from without, as though Germany didn't have enough of its own problems to be getting on with.
I think that's a fantastic image of the conductor that obviously that you've highlighted and that Thomas Mann painted, in that, in a way, to kind of dovetail everything we've talked about, the failure of the Weimar Republic politically, culturally, intellectually, is that the silent majority, the man on the street, never quite accepts it, always turns their nose up to it, to democracy, to party, to this new Germany, to the new cultural norms. And they would have, there's no doubt what they would have thought about something like the Weltbühne scandal exposing the German military. It's anti-patriotic. Let's then kind of draw things to a close with this final question. I think you might have alluded to it once or twice before, but what's then the fate after the Republic, after the Nazi seizure of power, of the characters we've been talking about?
Well, Czelski doesn't live to see the war. He, in fact, from 1926 onward, spends very little time in Germany. He moves to France, and he comes back, of course, briefly to take over the journal, and then passes it on to Czelski. And from then on, 1927, he lives in a variety of places in Denmark, in Paris, which was probably, I think, to judge from his writings, where he was happiest, where he felt, I suppose, most able to live and create without being constrained by all sorts of tacit sort of disapproval, to give it a kind word. Czelski dies in Sweden, in a little village a long way from anywhere, in, I think it was 1935, mid-30s anyway, having not, as I say, lifted his pen in anger for many a long year. And by that point, incidentally, he and his wife have split up. Mary Gerold, later to Czelski, the woman who he met way back at the beginning of the podcast in Courland, and who for him was representative of everything that Germany had been before Bismarck, really, before that line in the sand. She is for him the spirit of Courland, the region we were talking about earlier, which had for centuries been a German territory, first under the Teutonic Order, under chivalric order, and he longed for her in the years immediately after, the years straddling the end of the war and the start of the Weimar Republic, but even in the end, even with her, he couldn't be happy, and his political disillusionment of course, was probably the main reason for that. He had always been an unhealthy man, and the exact cause of his death is unknown. But breakdown, both physical and mental, certainly played into it. Ossietzky was given the Nobel Peace Prize in 1936. But by that point, he was in jail. The Nazis had, not for the first time, he found himself behind bars, and he wouldn't last either to see the war. The others, I mentioned earlier Bertolt Jacob. He was, like many of them, he was in France. He exiled himself to France, took refuge in France. He was actually tempted back to neutral Switzerland in the 30s by a former colleague of his on a leading German newspaper of the day, a man called Wassermann. And Wassermann, by that point, had been got to by the Gestapo, and he was an agent. And he delivered Jacob up to the Gestapo. He escaped, or rather, he didn't escape. He was, in fact, there was an international outcry that went all the way to The Hague. The Swiss objected to him being abducted and driven over the border back into Germany. But he let off on that occasion, along with the 15 other co-conspirators, as they were called, who had been jailed at the same time. But in the end, they get to him too. During the war, he's in France, and he's in Portugal by that point. He's trying to escape to America, and they capture him, and he doesn't survive either. I believe he was sentenced to death, but he didn't get that far. He, like Tucholsky and Ossietzky, his body simply broke down under the strain. So it's not a very happy ending. Those that did survive, most of them, well, certainly the most prominent ones, ended up in the US. Some of them returned. Walter Mehring is particularly he was prominent in the Weimar period. A journalist, a writer, but he never, I don't think he ever regained the status he had. And perhaps just as a footnote, interesting to note that Hermann Budislavski, who was at the time of the Nazis coming to power, a young reporter, he was briefly the editor of the Weltbühne in exile when it was published in several different places, in Prague, in Vienna, and I think in Paris. This lasted for 6 years until the outbreak of war. But Budislavski, who escaped to the US, on his return to post-war Germany, found a rejuvenated Weltbühne in operation, but it was by that point, and they wouldn't have admitted this publicly, but there are internal memos to show it. It was a party organ for the East German puppet government, and this is the sad really twist of the Weltbühne, that it went from being this resolutely non-partisan journal that reveled in attacking dogma, to actually being a mouthpiece for one of the more oppressive regimes of the post-war era, and and not many of those figures who had been such a thorn in the side of the Nazis in the interwar period would ever write for it again.
Well, that's as sometimes our episodes do end on a tragic note, because such is the way with history. But there we are. It's a remarkable story, and the whole picture of the really conflicted culture, I suppose, of Weimar in all its forms is a fascinating one. So we'd just like to thank you, Jack, for joining us and giving us so much of your time.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Peter.
Yes, well, with that being said, my name is Peter.
And I'm Alex, and thanks for listening to History's Most.
By any means necessary. Ich bin ein Berliner.
When Napoleon laid Boulogne for a year.
Zachary Davis,
Jamie Redfern,
Benjamin Jacobs,
I'm Eric Marcus,
Dan McMenemy,
Brian I, Free,
Rudyard Lynch,
Susan Archidale,
Alex Clifford, BT Newberg,
Raven Forrester Scalzo,
Stephen Guerra,
Elsa Chris,
David Crowther,
and I, Liz Covard, will be speaking alongside 40 other great content creators.
This will be an event that you don't want to miss.
Intelligent Speech is back. Intelligent Speech is an online conference dedicated to connecting the best independent educational content creators with their listeners.
This year's Intelligent Speech Conference will be held on Saturday, April 24th, starting at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, or, for our friends across the Atlantic, 3 p.m. London time.
Tickets will be $30, but are available for only $20 as an early bird special. You can get them online at intelligentspeechconference.com/shop.